Thank you for tuning in this afternoon. I'm very excited to share a bunch of stories with you all about Toronto's most notorious con artists and kidnappers. And I have a ton of stories to share, which it seems like I always do when I do one of these, and certainly had last week. So I should probably dive right in. I think I'm going to tell you three big stories about some of Toronto's Victorian con artists, and then we'll do a couple of strange kidnapping tales as well. And I thought that the place we might start is here, which is Toronto in the 1870s. So at this point, the city is about 80 years old as a settlement on this indigenous land. It's sort of a booming Victorian metropolis. The first railroads have arrived. The population's skyrocketing. It'll be 200,000 people by the end of the century. And it was right when it was looking like this that a new sort of famous figure arrived in our city. Her name was Elizabeth Cunard. She was the heiress to the Cunard steamship fortune. Cunard was one of the biggest shipping travel companies in the world. It's, I believe, still around today, which I actually just learned a few minutes before we started today. And so when Elizabeth Cunard arrived in Toronto, it would have been pretty big news, especially sort of among the upper classes and respectable society. And she started sort of showing up and making her presence very felt in the city. She even had a letter of introduction, so that when she met new people here, she'd have a letter sort of explaining who she was, with one of the Cunard family, I believe, vouching for her and asking whoever met her to kind of take good care of her, show her a warm welcome into our city. And she got a warm welcome indeed. Elizabeth Cunard, while she was in Toronto, seems to have gone on quite the shopping spree. She was splashing out, buying all sorts of goods, luxury items, all sorts of various things you could find on Yonge Street and King Street and all over the downtown core, going on this huge shopping spree that by the end of it had rung up something like a $10,000 bill, which this is the 1870s. So that is an absolute fortune. And so long ago that the Bank of Canada's inflation calculator doesn't even go back that far. It's kind of hard to translate in today's money. But even if it were 1914, this would be hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. And because she was Elizabeth Cunard, she managed to do it all without actually spending a penny yet at all. She'd managed to convince these stores to give her all of these goods on credit, thanks to that letter of recommendation. There's only one store I'm aware of where we can be pretty confident she didn't get anything. By this point, Timothy Eden's store had been open for a few years, the store that would grow to become the Eden's department store empire. It had a lot of revolutionary new practices. For instance, Timothy Eden set prices. Instead of having you haggle over things, you'd come in and know exactly how much you were going to pay. And the Timothy Eden Company had a no credit policy, which meant that Elizabeth Cunard must not have bought anything on credit there during the shopping spree, which must have been incredibly good news for Timothy Eden. Because before long, it became clear that Elizabeth Cunard wasn't Elizabeth Cunard at all. In fact, as far as I can tell, there might not have ever even been anyone named Elizabeth Cunard. She wasn't a wealthy heiress. She was a con artist whose original name was Elizabeth Bigley, not Cunard at all. She was from the area west of the city, and she'd have many, many names over the course of her life. Elizabeth Bigley and Elizabeth Cunard were just two among a whole litany of aliases she would use during her cons, and she'd earned plenty of nicknames as well. Some people have called her the queen of American con artists, although she was, in fact, Canadian, and the patron saint of confidence women. She would soon become maybe the single most notorious con artist on the continent. Some said the female Ponzi, after the guy Ponzi schemes are named in honor of, or even the female wizard of finance because of the high level financial scheming she was about to embark on. She's most famous as Cassie Chadwick, but that too isn't really her name. Cassie is what she went by, and Chadwick would become her married name. But her birth name, as I say, was Elizabeth Bigley. And she'd been born in a little town outside Woodstock, Ontario, and she seems to have gotten in trouble there from a very young age. It's hard sort of telling stories about con artists from history because they're very slippery in the historical record. You know, what they were doing was illegal. It's hard to find a lot of concrete evidence. And because these were big sensational tales, the press, I think, often sort of took things a little further than the truth. But according to some sources, Cassie had gotten started as a girl, still Elizabeth Bigley back then, when she went to a barber shop and asked for a haircut, trimming down her long hair so it would be short. An unusual request for a Victorian, teenage girl at the time. But it wasn't until she made her second request that the barber or the hairdresser got suspicious, because she then asked if she could have a fake mustache, at which point the barber shop decided she must be up to no good and phoned her father or called him over to take her home. And that was really just the beginning of her life of crime around Woodstock. Even after her big shopping spree in Toronto, which eventually collapsed, people realized she wasn't paying any of her bills and started getting suspicious. She went back to Woodstock with other forged documents. She'd have promissory notes saying that someone owed her money, and she'd head to stores and use them to get credit. And she started handing out a card that just said that she was Miss Bigley and that she was an heiress to $15,000. It's a suggestion, it's put the idea in my mind that people in the 1870s must have been a lot more trusting than they are today. We've had 150 stories of news items like this to look back on, because she just made this card herself and people just took it on face value. They figured no one would ever dare to just create their own card claiming to be an heiress. And so she was able to sort of start building a life of luxury, all based on these very fraudulent documents. And while she was occasionally getting in trouble with the law, it would also make her pretty rich. At one point in Woodstock, she was even arrested after one of these frauds and put on trial for it, but she managed to plead insanity. The court system believed her, and she ended up being released pretty much right away. At which point her family in Woodstock decided that they were sick of dealing with her and sent her off to live with her sister in Cleveland. So now on the other side of Lake Erie, on the other side of the border, and hopefully now that sister's problem instead of the rest of the families. And in Cleveland, she just kept going. At one point, when her sister left town to go visit Woodstock, Elizabeth Bigley ended up mortgaging all the furniture in her sister's house to get some quick cash. And she started launching her own con artist schemes in Cleveland as well. She set herself up as a clairvoyant, pretending to tell fortunes under a couple of different names, including Mademoiselle Lydia de Vere. But this was all just set up to con her customers. And so she ended up arrested once again, put on trial. Some of her victims started giving her a new nickname. They called her the Lady of the Hypnotic Eye. And they were convinced that she had hypnotized them in order to take advantage of them. It's a nickname that would stick with her for the rest of her life. But she was never behind bars for too long. I think a few years stint in prison at the very most, which freed her up to keep orchestrating these schemes. She even, in Cleveland, opened a brothel, which is where she would meet her next husband. By this point, she'd already had 3 of them. She married a man in Cleveland in her first marriage that only lasted 11 days because her Canadian relatives heard she'd gotten married and showed up at their door demanding he pay Cassie's debts. And then 2 more marriages after that also came and went pretty quickly as her husbands realized what she was up to. Her 4th and final husband was this guy, Leroy Chadwick in Cleveland, who was a doctor and seems to have been a customer at her brothel. And he ended up running into her there at the House of Ill Repute. And when he did, Cassie Chadwick launched another con. She was about to become Chadwick thanks to her excellent acting skills. When she ran into this handsome doctor, she pretended to faint when he told her that this was, in fact, a brothel. He thought she looked too respectable to be there, and so when he alerted her to the fact that her brothel was a brothel, she pretended to faint and then come to and say she had no idea and would certainly never have knowingly been found in a brothel, that she thought it was just a rooming house for young women that she was running. He bought it, hook, line, and sinker. They were married not long after, and she had herself a 4th husband, who must have been the wealthiest she had landed so far, because they ended up living in this very elegant home on Euclid Street in Cleveland, which was known there as their Millionaires Row. So Elizabeth Bigley, now Cassie Chadwick, was living quite a life of style. And it was while she was living there that she launched her biggest con of all, one that would land her on front pages worldwide. At one point, she took a trip to New York City and managed to convince an associate of her husband's to take her here to Andrew Carnegie's mansion. I believe it's still there today. And she ended up going inside the house while he waited outside, and she was gone for quite a while. In truth, we know that she was actually just talking to, I think, the housekeeper, sort of pretending and stringing her along so that it would look like she'd been inside the house meeting with Andrew Carnegie himself, maybe. And when she came back out of the house and met her husband's associate, she accidentally, or not so accidentally at all, dropped a piece of paper on the ground. And he saw it. It seemed to be another promissory note, this one for the staggering sum of $2 million made out to her by Andrew Carnegie himself. Now, Carnegie was one of the richest people in the entire world. This made it seem as if she was loaded herself thanks to this promissory note. And she told her husband's associate it was just the tip of the iceberg, that back home, she had 7 million more in these IOUs. She also told him what she claimed was her terrible secret, which is that she was, in fact, Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. And he felt so guilty about it and about not sort of treating her as one of the family that he was giving her these millions of dollars in IOUs to help assuage that guilt. And Further than that, she said when he died, she was in his will and she stood to inherit a fortune of $400 million, which would have made her one of the richest people on earth. And her husband's associate bought this hook, line, and sinker, just like her husband had bought her fainting spell. In fact, he took her to a bank with this note and made her put it in a safety deposit box to keep it safe. This thing was worth $2 million after all. And that's how word got out. I think it's probably supposed to be pretty confidential what you're putting in your safety deposit boxes, but news ended up spreading through the banking world in the United States that there was this illegitimate Carnegie out there who had a fortune herself. And they couldn't ask the Carnegie patriarch himself because she was supposed to be illegitimate. She said if anybody ever asked him, he would deny it because she was this terrible secret. And this ended up meaning that she got to up the level of wealth she was enjoying even more than this. She was already living on Millionaire's Row, but now she was drowning in money because all these banks were falling over themselves to give her even more loans because they all wanted that Carnegie business. She ended up becoming so wealthy and living such a wealthy lifestyle that some people started calling her the Queen of Ohio while she was living there in Cleveland. And the whole time this was happening, she maintained her ties to our city. In 1902, she made another visit to Toronto, this time to purchase some jewels. Lots of newspaper stories talk about who her favorite jeweler was, and we know that they were in Toronto. And piecing the evidence together, I suspect very strongly it was probably Ryrie Brothers, who would later merge with Burks and become Ryrie and Burks, a brand that's still around today, I believe. They had a successful enough business, the Ryrie Brothers, that they were just about to build this big headquarter, Diamond Hall at Yonge and Temperance Street. And you can see their sign there on top of the building facing the other way. And I know for sure that she was a customer because there are conversations, interviews with one of the Ryrie brothers in the newspapers after all of this came to light. So we know she was buying jewels from them. And if they were, in fact, the ones that are referred to as her favorite jeweler, she was getting them to give her tons and tons of jewelry. The Ryries, thankfully, didn't fall for most of her schemes, it seems, if any at all. They remained rich the rest of their lives. You can actually see evidence of them around the city, hidden in plain sight, everywhere we go in the Toronto parks system. Because Harry Ryrie, one of the Ryrie brothers, left part of this jewelry fortune to the city of Toronto for the payment of an establishment of 600 benches in Toronto parks. They look exactly like this. They're still around today, more than a century later. They're known as Ryrie benches, often painted green. There are others that look very similar, but the original Ryries are these ones that have this sort of particularly whole pattern on their concrete ends, all still in our parks today, thanks to this old jewelry money. So it's maybe for the best that Cassie Chadwick wasn't able to take them for everything they were worth, though she took them, it seems, for plenty, often paying for it, I suspect, from the con she was running on other people. We do know that from her favorite Toronto jeweler, she bought something like 56 rings and plenty of other jewelry on top of that. She loved draping herself in jewelry and diamonds. At one point, she even got her favorite Toronto jeweler to travel to Europe because she heard about a diamond that she just absolutely had to have. And so she did. This jeweler tracked it down and brokered the purchase. It was said to be, at the time, the most valuable diamond ever imported into Canada. And it was for the con artist, Cassie Chadwick, thanks to that Toronto jeweler. Her luck, however, was just about to run out, finally. One of the bankers that she was working with started to get suspicious. He asked her to pay, I think, at least part of the money she owed him back, and she refused and didn't do it. At which point he started to realize just how many other loans she had out with so many other American banks. And now word got out that she wasn't paying her debts, and the whole thing caused a bit of a panic. Now she was suddenly front page news. This one from the Globe newspaper, a special dispatch from Woodstock looking back at her roots. They're calling her the lady of the hypnotic eye, talking about her visits to Toronto and how much she splashed out while she was here, though all on this fraudulent credit. And eventually she was arrested and put on trial. It would be a big sensational case, one of the biggest of its era, in part because she had borrowed from these huge banks these enormous sums. So at least one, and some sources say two American banks, including the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, ended up collapsing, going bankrupt. Countless ordinary people who'd invested their life savings in these banks ended up losing them entirely, because that's how big this con was, that it was able to bring down entire banks. She had borrowed so much. In the end, she would be found guilty. Andrew Carnegie actually went to the trial himself so he could see her face to face, making huge headlines again around the world. She would end up spending the rest of her life in prison this time. She died just a few years later. And though she had lived in the United States for so much of her life, when she did die, her body was taken back to Canada, back to her hometown, and was buried. She was buried in Woodstock. She's still there in a cemetery today. The name on her tombstone is her original one, Elizabeth Bigley. But you can see she's also listed as the wife of Dr. Chadwick, reminding you that this is the grave of the notorious Cassie Chadwick. And she's far from the only big North American con artist. In those days, people were moving back and forth across the border with incredible ease and speed like they'd never had before. The late 1800s becomes a huge era for cross-border crime because the first railroads have arrived. You can now travel across the border from a city like Chicago to Toronto in just hours, which had never been possible before. And it's before the United States and Canada, who'd really been enemies just earlier that century. It's only decades since the War of 1812. There'd been all sorts of tensions and fears of another American invasion during the American Civil War. So there's no comprehensive extradition treaty between Canada and the United States. There's a limited one that lists just 9 crimes that you can be extradited for, and embezzlement and some of these con artist schemes aren't on that list. It's mostly about things like murder, bigger crimes that have been a bigger problem in the first half of the century. And so people started taking advantage of that, thousands of them. For Toronto, our closest relationship with these schemes was with the city of Chicago, which you see here, because bankers in Chicago realized that there was nothing stopping them from taking the money out of the bank where they worked and then heading across the border. And so many American bankers started doing this. They'd work at their bank all day as if nothing unusual was happening. And at the end of the business day, they'd steal all the money out of the bank, close up the bank for the evening, and then catch the evening train from Chicago to Toronto. There was one conveniently located just a couple of hours after the end of the business day that would see you getting off the train at the old Union Station within hours, and now outside American jurisdiction, beyond the arm, the reach of the American law. And so huge numbers of people started doing this. There was a train from Chicago to Toronto. There was one from New York to Montreal as well that was even shorter, I think. They called them boodlers, and called it the practice boodling. These people who are stealing money out of these banks and then fleeing across the border, 2,000 of them are thought to have come here. And once they got here, there was nothing the American authorities could do. So they'd made it away with their loot. And there were some very notorious American crime figures, crime bosses who took advantage of this lack of an extradition treaty as well, including some of the most notorious American gangsters of this era. Marm Mandelbaum was one of them. Friederike Mandelbaum had been born in Germany, but set up shop in New York in the middle of the 1800s. Started, I think, mostly as a fence, selling stolen goods, got involved in some of the biggest bank robberies in American history at the time, and sort of established herself as a dominant crime boss in New York. She made friends with the other gangsters, got a reputation for being fair and honest in her underhanded dealings. Even the chief of police had to admit that she'd attained a reputation as a businesswoman whose honesty in criminal matters was absolute. She's been called the first real crime lord in New York City history. She set up a school for criminals. She taught kids how to be pickpockets. She'd taken advantage of a big stock market crash, or the event at the time that was known as the Great Depression in the 1870s, where all these poor children were roaming the streets and turned them into criminals. Had this whole big gang, this big operation that would eventually get taken down. Her luck ran out, just like Cassie Chadwick's eventually did. They got a new attorney general, and this new attorney general was determined to shut her down. And he knew that all the police officers, or at least enough of them on the New York City police force, were being paid off by Marm Mandelbaum, that he could never use police officers to take her down. And instead, he hired a private detective from the Pinkerton Agency, this private sort of police force that you could hire out, and sent one officer, one detective, Gustav Frank, into Marm Mandelbaum's criminal operation as an undercover detective, pretending to be a criminal just like her, right up until the point where he was able to reveal himself and bring her down. She said to have punched him in the nose when he revealed himself, and said something like, "Oh, so you're the one behind all this nonsense." But it meant now that she was arrested and put on trial for her crimes. When the court date came and they called out her name, no one answered. They called again and there was still no reply. Marm Mandelbaum hadn't shown up to court that day. Instead, she'd gotten on a train to Canada. She ended up moving to Toronto at first. She set up shop in her first few days right here on King Street. This is King and York. And that building, sort of the 4-5-story one in the middle of the photo, that's the old Rawson House Hotel, one of our fanciest and most famous at the time. She ended up staying there for 5 days, maybe thinking that she'd set up shop in Toronto and make it part of her new crime empire. Some sources say that she had maybe misjudged just how notorious she was. Here's a news article from The Globe calling her the latest American refugee who had come across the border. It turned out people actually knew who she was, even here, even outside the United States. So she decided Toronto maybe was a little too hot for her. She ended up moving to Hamilton instead. But there she was again beyond the reach of the American law. This is actually how she first came to my attention, as I stumbled across this cartoon someone shared on Blue Sky when all these tariff war news items started breaking. And it's Marm Mandelbaum, who many called Mother, personified as Canada itself, leaning across a fence that represents the border between the US and Canada, sort of taunting Uncle Sam, who can't get at her because she's on Canadian soil. In the distance, you'll see another boodler tipping his cap, and there are some flags flying from buildings back there that they're the names of some other famous boodlers and crime lords who had come across the border in a time when they were untouchable once they got here. It was really the 1880s, in this period between the first big high-profile case and the time when a new extradition treaty was negotiated. People for a long time hadn't realized this loophole existed, but when the first famous criminal made use of it, suddenly people knew all about it thanks to the newspapers and started doing it themselves, Marm Mandelbaum included. She ended up regretting the decision, though. Seems that Hamilton, Ontario wasn't quite her speed. She ended up telling others that she was sorry she had ever left New York and that she should have stayed and faced the music. Instead, she'd spend her final years living in Ontario. She ended up dying in Hamilton at the end of her life. She wasn't the only one, though, doing this, as I say, and that included some of her own associates. Marm Mandelbaum had tons of criminals in New York that she had taken under her wing, but this was her favorite student, her protege, Sophie Lyons, nicknamed the Princess of Crime. Some call her the Queen of the Burglars. She learned a lot from Marm Mandelbaum and put it into practice herself. Bank robberies, con artist schemes, pickpocketing. Sophie Lyons did it all and ended up moving back and forth across the border, usually to Montreal, and taking advantage of the lack of coordination between Canadians and Americans. She did a lot of it with her husband, too, Ned Lyons, who was known as the king of the bank robbers. He had pulled off one of the highest profile bank heists in American history. He and his associates had rented a place underneath a bank and then drilled up through their ceiling into the bank vault to steal $1 million worth of cash and bonds, I think. An absolute, again, incredible fortune for the late 1800s. It made him unbelievably notorious. And Sophie Lyons was too. In fact, at one point, they'd both been caught and thrown into Sing Sing prison, but that prison wouldn't hold them for long. Ned Lyons managed to craft a disguise that allowed him to slip out of Sing Sing, and soon he came back for his wife, Sophie, got her out of Sing Sing as well, had a sleigh waiting for them that hurried them off to New York City, where they caught a train across the border to Montreal, again, outside American law. But Ned's last big scheme, or at least one of the last big ones, would happen here in Toronto. He had a presence here as well. It was a con that was incredibly common at the time. If you search the Old Globe and Star Archives for it, you'll find dozens of articles written about what was known as a green goods scam. And the whole thing was set up to convince people they were going to get a good deal on some counterfeit money. The idea was that they would send out basically flyers to huge numbers of people in a city like Toronto, and you can find news articles about this happening, about people receiving things, I guess, in the mail that were ads telling them that they could buy money cheap because the con artist had managed to steal a plate from a mint and was making money that therefore matched exactly what the mint was making because they had some of the mint's own machinery to do it with. And this pitch always suggested that they were now running into hard times. They needed some quick cash, so they were willing to get rid of this counterfeit money at a steal in order just to be done with it and get some quick cash. So one notorious con artist said to Torontonians that he was willing to sell $75,000 worth of counterfeit money for just $2,000, $73,000 profit for whoever bought it. For $500 more, you could be guaranteed exclusivity in a lot of these deals so that no one else in your jurisdiction, in your state or province would be allowed to buy the same counterfeit money to sort of help cover your tracks and make sure it wasn't uncovered. Sometimes they even told stories about the fact that they had been arrested and put on trial for it and then acquitted because the counterfeit money passed so well. The queer, they called it, this make-believe money. And countless people in Toronto seem to have fallen for these green goods scams. But once you bought the money, you found that you'd been conned. You'd meet the con artist somewhere. They'd show you a bag filled with cash. You'd get to look at it, see it yourself. It would look absolutely perfect, not counterfeit at all, because it wasn't actually counterfeit money. They were showing you real money, but then they'd distract you for a moment, and the card artist or an associate would switch out the bags. And when you left with this new fortune you had just bought at a discount, and you opened the bag again, you would find it most often filled with sawdust or tissue paper or useless fake green paper. I'm not sure they used coal, but good luck finding a clip art image of a bag full of sawdust. It is not easy to find. So I've used coal here for our slide. Ned Lyons, he was one of the most infamous green goods scammers in North America. And right at the end of his life, his luck on that front seems to have run out while he was running one of these green goods scams in Toronto. He was using a fake name, as these con artists so often did, calling himself Alexander Cummings, when he was arrested and put on trial. And people started recognizing him. As you can see in this article, they're wondering whether this Alexander Cummings is the notorious bank robber who pulled that $1 million heist. And indeed, he was. He ended up being kicked out of Toronto as a result and ended up dying not long after in the United States, having led this notorious life of crime right up to the end. Some con artists, though, they were actually celebrating. This is what Toronto looked like in the 1890s. And you were looking for one of the other most notorious con artists in North American history, you would have found them right here in the East End, at the corner of Queen and Broadview, at Toronto's first baseball stadium, officially known as the Toronto Baseball Grounds, but eventually nicknamed Sunlight Park. The team playing there in 1887 included all sorts of colorful players. They'd be the first team to win our City of Baseball championship. The ace of their pitching staff and their greatest slugger was this guy Cannonball Crane, who could throw a fastball faster than any other pitcher on earth and would soon be invited to tour the world as part of a big baseball promotion, a world trip that he mostly spent getting drunk on board the ship with his new pet monkey. But probably the most notorious player on the team was his battery mate, the catcher he was throwing to, this guy, Harry Decker. Decker had started out in Chicago himself on the other side of the border as one of the most promising young prospects there. He was signed to a deal as a teenager, but then started getting in trouble pretty much right away. His first season with the Indianapolis Hoosiers, he ended up leaving the team, quitting his job halfway through a game, quitting not just the team, in fact, but the entire league. While he was playing that day, some rival league players or owners had shown up waving around a bunch of cash. He decided halfway through the game he was going to switch leagues, faked a finger injury that resulted in him getting taken out of the game, and he never came back. Went off and became part of the Players League, which then crashed, folded very quickly, and ended up with him being banned from Major League Baseball for the following season. And as part of his baseball career, he was running cons all the time. leading up to that 1887 season he spent in Toronto, he'd actually signed contracts with 3 different teams in 3 different cities, Washington, Rochester, and Toronto, so that he could try to cash the checks for all 3 signing bonuses, or all 3 payments. He made a mistake, though. He tried to cash 2 of those checks at the same time with the same bank teller, who turned out to be a former board member of the Washington baseball team who recognized the deceit. He then tried to claim, while signing other contracts, that he was 3 different catchers to try to get those 3 checks. He was eventually caught because one of the teams showed up to the mailing address, found just an empty lot with Harry Decker pacing up and down the street waiting for the check to arrive, at which point he claimed there were 2 different Harry Deckers who were both Major League Baseball catchers. He was just one of them. They did not believe that lie. He often said when he was caught for things that he couldn't possibly be that stupid. Sometimes he blamed it on getting kicked in the head by a horse or getting a ball to the head. But all his work started drying up, which is how he ended up with Toronto for, I think, the next few seasons. One year he hit .333, was one of the best on the team. He even invented a new kind of catcher's mitt while he was here for catchers. That's why some people still call them Deckers to this day, but then sold off his patent cheap to get some quick cash instead of investing it. The Spalding Sporting Goods Company would make a fortune off his design, having only paid him $50 for it. So he was kind of an inventor too, but his cons overlapped with them. One point, he sold a new kind of turnstile to the Baker Bowl in Philadelphia. It soon spread across the country, became the standard turnstile for stadiums and fairs and other events. But it seems like he might have actually just run that as a con, that he had stolen a turnstile from the Baker Bowl, filed off the branding and the inventor's name, and then sold it back to Philadelphia as a brand new invention. And he was running schemes like that all the time. A counterfeit artist who had managed at one point to forge the signature of Albert Spalding, the co-founder of the National League. He once was caught with a bunch of counterfeit money and then forged the signature of the detective who had caught him for it so he could try to get out of trouble. He stole from his roommates and his teammates. He stole suits of clothing and bicycles and horses. Traveled under so many different names that the police eventually lost track of what his real name was. Said the only thing they knew about him was that he had grown up in Pittsburgh, which is not a city he grew up in at all. In his court cases, he tended to plead insanity or pretend to have tuberculosis. At one point, he got a mark removed from his face, but he'd be harder to identify. And when all his other tricks failed, his wealthy parents usually managed to bail him out, sometimes quite literally. The Pinkertons were very aware of him too. One said that he knew that the term "one of the most dangerous men in the country" was overused at the time, but that it definitely applied to Harry Decker. He was running so many cons, he must have had a hard time keeping track of them all. They say he changed his name every time he boarded a train. And he had a pretty complicated romantic life too. He was at one point charged with bigamy for having multiple wives. His main squeeze seems to have been a pretty disturbing one. He'd gotten a 15-year-old girl pregnant who'd be charged with statutory rape by someone else as well. And Annie, who then married him after getting pregnant, got sick of his ways pretty quickly. They were divorced after not much time at all. He was such a womanizer that some reporters called him the Don Juan of the Diamond. And he said it was just a stroke of bad luck, that he was a most unfortunate man, and that if he merely looked at a girl, she fancied him so much that a breach of promise suit is the result. And he was certainly sued for breach of promise as well, for having told someone he would marry them in order to get to sleep with them, and then broke that promise. Eventually, teams started getting sick of this too. He was incredibly talented, had a ton of potential, but he was getting arrested all the time, having to miss games. halfway through the season, the Nutmegs ended up releasing him. He'd never play in Major League Baseball again, and before long had disappeared entirely. No one knew what had happened to Harry Decker, though he popped up one more time in the future, in a pretty likely or unlikely place, depending on how you look at it. The Los Angeles Angels baseball team had donated some uniforms to San Quentin Prison for the baseball players among the prisoners. They used to play pickup games in the yard. And the prison sent the Angels manager a thank you, which was a photograph of the players, presumably wearing these new uniforms. And when a reporter got a look at that photo, he realized one of the faces in the photo was familiar. He was there serving time under yet another false name, but there was no mistaking his face, that was Harry Decker. So the final team he seems to have ever played for was the baseball team at San Quentin Prison, and then he disappears from history altogether. No one has ever been able to track down what happened to Harry Decker after that. Now, we don't have much longer left today, but I've spent almost all of the time talking about con artists. So I'm going to try to quickly tell you the stories of two notorious kidnappings before I say goodbye for the afternoon. And maybe, certainly, one of the strangest in Toronto history took place here on Grenville Avenue, which is just around the corner from Yonge and College. And in the 1870s, it was the home of this guy, Robert Jaffray. He ran the finest grocery store in town, just over on Yonge Street. He was also deeply involved in politics, a huge supporter of the Liberal Party. He would eventually become a Liberal senator. He was appointed by the first federal Liberal government ever to serve on an important railway board, hugely associated with the Liberal Party in its early days, which is what seems to have made him some pretty sketchy enemies. One night, when he'd come home from work and then popped out to pick up a telegram, he got a knock at the door. It was a little late for visitors after 10 p.m., but he had just gotten home, so he opened the door himself and found a man he didn't know standing there on his front porch. The man told him that he, the visitor, was a Secret Service detective named Robertson, who'd been sent to collect Jaffray on behalf of a local judge, that some of his affairs were being investigated and he needed to go answer some questions immediately. The man even had a letter from the judge to show him. Jaffray invited him inside, read the letter under the dim gaslight in his dining room, and in that dim light seems to have missed all the spelling mistakes and the fact that his name, Jaffray, was spelt differently twice within just a few lines. So he believed the detective and agreed to go with him, went outside and climbed into a waiting carriage that then took off through the city, heading east along a purposefully confusing route. They headed along Carlton and then down to King Street, across the bridge over the Don River, made it all the way almost to the beaches before then doubling back and heading northwest for a while, before coming to a stop near this spot in the Don Valley, not far from where Riverdale Park is today. There was a second man who'd been riding up front with the driver. One of these men told him that this was the place, that he was supposed to get out here. But even in the darkness, he knew they weren't high atop the Scarborough Bluffs where the judge had his summer home. And so Robert Jaffray refused to get out of the carriage, so they had to drive him to the judge if they wanted him to get out, which is when the kidnappers came clean. "I'm sorry we've had to deceive you so long," the detective Robertson told him, "but we may as well now tell you that we are members of a secret revolutionary political organization, that he was in their power and had to do what he said." Now, we don't know much about this revolutionary political organization. We do know that they were called the Canadian League, and that they were a secret society of conservative supporters who concocted a bizarre plan to kidnap famous liberals for some unknown reason. And these two men who had just kidnapped Robert Jaffray, Thomas Deal and John Deal, were brothers who were also members of the Canadian League, sworn to secrecy as the League concocted this plan. Robert Jaffray wasn't their only target. George Brown, the father of Confederation, owner of the Globe newspaper, close associate of Jaffray's. Jaffray would one day run the Globe himself. He was on their kidnapping list. In fact, some strange men had shown up to his house just a couple of nights earlier, but he had refused to go with them. Even the Premier of Ontario, Oliver Mowat, was one of their kidnapping targets as well. So Jaffray knew something was wrong, but he didn't know the truth, which is that the Deal brothers had been working on this plan for months. They managed to rent a little bit of land on the slope of the Don Valley, where they'd been digging a big hole in the eastern slope, big enough to fit a few people inside, a cave they reinforced with lumber, and seems to have been the place they were going to keep these famous liberals that they kidnapped. We still don't know why they did it, if they were looking for ransom money or as part of some bizarre political scheme, but Jaffray told them whatever they were up to, they were clearly up to no good and would not do what they told him to do, and continued to refuse to get out of the carriage, at which point Thomas Deal pulled out a pistol, and Robert Jaffray decided actually he would get out of the carriage after all. But he still wasn't about to give up. He could see a light in the distance coming from a nearby cottage, and he sort of started trying to make his way toward it after he got out of the carriage, at which point the Deal brothers made it clear that they were going to try to stop them. Thomas Deal reminded him that he had that gun, claimed to have a bunch of backup, that if he fired the gun, 30 men would appear from out of the woods around them, I guess. But Robert Jaffray, he was not going to be intimidated. Fire at once, then, he called their bluff and started making his way toward the cottage. The Deal brothers tried to hold him back, grabbed him by the arms, and pulled him away from that distant light. But Robert Jaffray was no easy mark when it came to street fighting. These are days when Canadian politics were incredibly dangerous and violent. Robert Jaffray has stories about having fought through crowds with George Brown, about the Conservatives hiring a big thug to keep people from voting in a polling station so that the Liberals just got a bigger thug and drove that one off. He'd even, in his younger days, seen an old man who was being prevented from voting by a Conservative mob. Robert Jaffray had gotten together a group of young men and then rescued the old man so he could vote, an old man who turned out to be none other than William Lyon Mackenzie, the rebel mayor, first mayor of Toronto, who tried to lead an army down Yonge Street and overthrow British rule. So Robert Jaffray had plenty of experience with physical brawling, and so managed to fight the Deal brothers off and continued racing toward the cottage. And once he got to the edge of a big beam of light, the Deal brothers pulled back, scared of being seen. With one last sprint across a patch of shadow, Robert Jaffray managed to reach the front door of the cottage, and as he knocked on it, he could hear the Deal brothers' carriage pulling away across a bridge over the river. He was finally free. He managed to reach a nearby toll keeper's cottage. They led him back into the city, into safety. The Deal brothers, they'd be on the lam for the next few weeks, seemed to disappear without a trace. But they turned back up in Montreal thanks to an incredibly dumb mistake. The Deal brothers might not actually have been criminal masterminds. Thomas Deal wanted to send their mom a letter, an update on what was happening. He enclosed a couple of others too, to his sweetheart and to a friend. But when he sent that letter to his mom, whose name was Mrs. Rose, he accidentally mailed it to the wrong Mrs. Rose. And by this point, the kidnapping was on front pages across the country. The woman who received the letters turned them over to the police, and the Deal brothers were arrested when they showed up at a train station in Montreal, leading to yet another sensational case. Thomas, in particular, would be sentenced to a couple of years in prison while his brother got off. Robert Jaffray, thankfully, was safe and was able to head back home. But he wasn't the last member of his family to get kidnapped. In fact, he wasn't the last Robert Jaffray to get kidnapped. His son was in the house that night, presumably. He was about 5 years old at the time. His name was Robert A. Jaffray, and he'd end up being a kidnapping victim himself. His dad had always wanted to grow up so he could take over the globe and his business interests, but Robert A. Jaffray decided to become a Christian missionary instead, ended up heading off to China, and spent the rest of his life in Asia trying to convert people there. In 1924, half a century after his dad was kidnapped, Robert A. Jaffray was kidnapped too by bandits on a river in Guangxi. He kept there in the mountains for a while, but seems to have earned the bandits' respect and managed to convince them to release him to go get some ransom money. But then it wasn't the last time he'd be captured either. When the Second World War broke out, he was in Indonesia. When the Japanese invaded, he was rounded up and sent off to an internment camp, which is where he'd spend the rest of his life. He ended up dying just a few weeks before the war ended, but was stubborn to the end, cheerful and smiling even in his final days as he suffered this malnutrition. And so he, in a lot of ways, I think, showed the same resilience his father had, being kidnapped on the Don Valley all those decades earlier. That's more stories. There are tons of them out there. I wish I'd been able to include today. I would have told you about the Labatt kidnapping, when one of the Labatt heirs was kidnapped for ransom money before the press got a hold of it and the kidnappers released him. A guy named Three Fingered Abe, the leader of that gang. And the strange story of Mel Lastman's wife, Marilyn, who seems to have maybe been kidnapped the day Mel Lastman became mayor of North York, turned up again after 10 hours with this kidnapping story that has strange details. And so half a century after that one, it's still not entirely clear whether she was really kidnapped at all. There's stories I've shared and will continue to share, but we've run out of time for today. So I want to thank you all so much for tuning in. If you're interested in more of my stuff coming up, my Festival of Bizarre Toronto History is just a couple of weeks away. I'm doing lots for Doors Open next week too. I'm running a sports history panel on the Thursday night and doing a bunch of Toronto sports history walking tours during Doors Open as well. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Sergio and the Toronto Public Library for having us. I'm sorry I used up all the time, so that we're right up against 1 p.m. But I hope you enjoyed the stories, and I was delighted to be able to share them with you.